Surrey, England, 1843. Rain fell in dense, shimmering veils over the iron gates of Stonebridge Park as Evangeline emerged from the woods, breathless, her soaked dress clinging tightly to her skin. Every step was a knife to her bare, torn feet, still bleeding from the fall out of the carriage. Yet none of it hurt as much as the panic crushing her chest. Behind her, far but closing in, the echo of hooves tore through the wind. Men were calling her name, their voices warped by the fury of her father. He always sent someone. He always found her. But this time she swore she would not go back. Hours earlier, locked in the room her family used as proof of her supposed madness, she had listened to the preparations for the journey. The asylum. The destiny he had chosen to silence her forever. She escaped in the only moment she had, the carriage slowing on a curve, the servant glancing the other way. Her leap cost her the skin on her knees and her breath, but not her freedom. Now, before the towering gates of a property she had never seen, Evangeline pressed both hands against the cold bars. The lights of the manor shimmered through the rain, promising life, warmth, and what she feared most to crave, safety. She gathered what little voice she had left. "Please," she cried, pounding the gate. "Please, someone help me." For a heartbeat, only the roar of the storm answered. Then hurried footsteps. A liveried footman ran toward the gate, shock widening his eyes as he took in her soaked, bloodied, trembling form. "My lady, you're hurt." "I need shelter," she whispered, breath breaking. "Just for a night. I beg you." Before he could reply, a sound cut through the rain, rising from deep within the house. The sharp, desperate wail of a child. A cry that seemed to slice through walls and intentions alike. Evangeline lifted her face. She did not know it yet, but that sound would change everything. Evangeline did not know the name of the man watching her from the top of the stone staircase. She could not imagine he was a duke, nor that his estate stretched for miles, nor that a quiet grief lingered in every corner of that dim house. All she knew, with an urgency burning through her veins, was that she needed him to say yes. At 23, she should have been married already, living the discreet life expected of a baron's daughter. But Evangeline Warwick had never been discreet. Lord Percival Warwick had repeated it so many times she nearly believed him. Hysterical, disobedient, unfit. When she dared to love a simple lieutenant, David Farrow, and bore his child in secret, her father's verdict came colder than a sentence: insane. The child vanished before she could hold him a second time. Her father claimed the baby had died, but Evangeline knew that look in his eyes too well, the one he wore when he lied, along with the haste in his orders to lock her away. Months of confinement followed, along with the relentless insistence that everything had been a delusion, that her son had never existed, that her mind was too fragile to trust. That night, when her father's man escorted her into the carriage meant to deliver her to the asylum, Evangeline jumped. The fall tore her feet and knees open, but she ran anyway, driven by a single thought: if I stop now, he will never be found. Each step burned, yet she did not stop until the iron gates rose before her. At the top of the staircase, the Duke of Stonebridge appeared, his stride controlled, his dark cloak billowing behind him like a loyal shadow. His face carried the exhaustion of a man who had barely slept since his wife's death. Grace, his 3-month-old daughter, cried for hours, unconsoled by any arms. Her cries echoed through the mansion at that very moment, splitting the heavy silence. And there, standing before him, was this woman drenched in rain, trembling, yet holding her spine straight out of sheer will. "I cannot help you," Gideon said, harsher than he intended. "This is not an inn." Evangeline felt her strength falter, but she drew a breath, clinging to the last truth she had left. For an instant, her child's face, the weight of him in her arms, the newborn scent, flashed through her mind like a ghost. "I know how to care for children," she murmured. Her voice wavered, but the resolve beneath it did not. "The baby who's crying, I can soothe her." Gideon glanced at his butler, who gave a worried nod. Grace had been crying for hours. Again. He should have sent this stranger away. The house still held his wife's scent, her folded dresses, the cradle no one dared touch. Allowing another woman to cross that threshold felt like breaking the last boundary between morning and the world. But the desperation in Evangeline's eyes, so much like his own, held him still. At last, he stepped aside and told them to open the gate. "One night," he said, his voice still cold, "and only if you can do what you promise." Evangeline crossed the gates, exhausted, frozen, offering what remained of herself to this fragile chance, as someone placing her last flame into the dark. And when little Grace's wail echoed through the mansion again, she closed her eyes. She remembered another child, the warmth that had barely touched her arms, and a lullaby she had not dared to sing until that night. Chapter 1. The Gate and the Promise. The entrance hall of Stonebridge Park was more breathtaking than Evangeline had ever dared imagine. Golden light poured from crystal chandeliers, scattering soft reflections over the carved moldings and the muted sheen of polished marble. The warmth of the fireplaces embraced the air, chasing away the cold that clung stubbornly to her skin. The scent of waxed wood mingled with the delicate perfume of dried flowers, arranged by someone with a gentle touch. The thick carpet swallowed most footsteps, except hers. Every damp step, every drop sliding from her soaked dress felt like a mistake, as if this floor had never been meant to hold someone like her. But nothing here was truly comforting. The cry coming from upstairs ripped through the space with startling force, turning the bright hall into a chamber of distress. It wasn't simply a cry, it was a scream, a pain too fierce for such a tiny body. The sound vibrated through the walls, through her chest, through her bones. The mansion, for all its grandeur, seemed to shrink beneath that anguish. Evangeline stopped in the vestibule, acutely aware of the servant's eyes upon her. She must have looked like an apparition. Dress plastered to her body, dark hair stuck to her face, bare feet streaked with mud and blood. Her legs shook, whether from cold, exhaustion, or fear. She couldn't tell. But her gaze never left the staircase, where the cries spilled down like a torrent. A middle-aged housekeeper descended, a baby in her arms. Her immaculate apron stood in stark contrast to her flushed, strained face. The little one writhed, fists clenched tight, her cries rising to an almost unbearable pitch. "Your Grace, I've tried everything." The housekeeper's voice was hoarse, on the edge of breaking. "Milk, songs, rocking. Nothing works. 3 hours, sir. 3 hours without stopping." Near the fireplace, Gideon Carver, Duke of Stonebridge, stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back. Evangeline noticed the pain before she noticed the title. A man worn thin, held upright by nothing but stubborn resolve. The shadows beneath his eyes were deep, carved by grief that sharpened every breath, every movement. It was the same helplessness she knew well, the same that had consumed her during the months locked away, while they insisted day after day that her child had never existed. Evangeline inhaled, the metallic taste flooding her mouth. Her voice rose before she was sure she could speak. "May I try?" she asked. "Please, let me try." The housekeeper froze, startled by the drenched stranger. Her eyes flicked toward the Duke, waiting for the expected refusal. Gideon turned slowly. Evangeline felt the weight of that look, sharp, wary, wounded. He took her in from muddy feet to rain-soaked hair, a woman with no references, no past offered, no explanation. A stranger who had appeared at his gate in the middle of a storm. Grace kept crying. Every second of hesitation seemed to cut through him like a blade. "Try," he said. The word came rough, worn thin. Evangeline stepped forward. The carpet yielded beneath her injured feet. The housekeeper eyed her dripping dress, and before Evangeline could protest, pulled the thick wool shawl from her own shoulders. "I can't hand you the child like this," she murmured urgently, wrapping Evangeline tightly in the warm fabric, fastening it across her arms and chest. "She can't get wet." The sudden heat against her frozen skin made Evangeline gasp. Only then did the housekeeper, still reluctant, nod her approval. When Evangeline extended her arms, there was a heartbeat of hesitation, a final instinct to protect. Then, defeated by exhaustion and the silent plea in front of her, the housekeeper lowered the baby, already shielded by blankets, into Evangeline's newly warmed embrace. Grace was hot, far too hot. Her tiny face was red and swollen, her blue eyes unfocused from so much crying, and the moment that small body settled against her, Evangeline felt the world split open, past and present colliding like two waves crashing into one another. There was pain, deep, ancient, but also a strange, quiet recognition. She rocked the baby gently, a movement rising from somewhere old inside her, something instinctive. And then she sang. The lullaby had no clear words, only soft sounds, gliding through a melody her mother once sang to her, and that she herself had whispered to Michael in the precious hours she held him. It was almost a prayer. The effect was slow. The sharp cries shifted into stubborn sobs, then into a weary whimper. Grace eased little by little until her small body gave in, surrendering to the exhaustion that had seemed impossible moments before. A tiny yawn escaped her lips. Her eyelids drooped, heavy, then closed completely. Silence. A silence so deep it felt miraculous. The housekeeper covered her mouth with a hand. The butler exhaled, perhaps for the first time in hours. Even the air in the room seemed to soften, as if something tight and invisible had finally loosened. Evangeline kept singing until she was sure the child slept. Only then did her voice fade, like a candle burning to its end. Gideon stepped closer. Then he stood before her. He saw her soaked hair clinging to her neck, the silent tears mingling with the rain on her cheeks. They weren't ordinary tears. They held a kind of relief that came from far away, from deep within. "Who are you?" he asked softly, as if any louder sound might wake the child. Evangeline lifted her face. She had to draw breath before she could speak. "Someone who needed to be here," she whispered, her voice trembling, "as much as she needed me." Gideon didn't understand. Not yet. All he knew was that his daughter slept, for the first time in days, and it had happened in the arms of a woman he should have turned away. Should have, but didn't. "Prepare a room for her," he ordered, without looking directly at Evangeline. "Until we find another solution." He told himself it would be for one night. He had no idea how wrong he was. Chapter 2. The Weight of Silence. Gideon hadn't expected to sleep that night. Sitting in the leather armchair of the library, he watched the soft flames shifting in the hearth. The brandy beside him remained untouched, as if lifting the glass required more strength than he possessed. The house was quiet for the first time in weeks, a silence that should have comforted him, yet somehow left him even more unsettled. Too much silence can be dangerous for a man who has spent nights fighting his own mind. Grace was asleep. His daughter, who had cried with a nameless anguish since the day she lost her mother, was finally resting. And all because of a woman he barely knew, who had appeared at his gates like someone running from her own shadow. Gideon recognized that look, the look of someone fleeing something impossible to face. He dragged a hand across his face, feeling the roughness of his beard and the heavy weight of exhaustion. Gratitude should have been enough. He should accept the miracle and let her care for Grace until he found a proper nurse. But what troubled him wasn't her presence. It was the way she had held his daughter, like someone who remembers the weight of a baby and the ache of losing one. He rose and walked to the window. Rain drifted softly over the dark gardens of Stonebridge Park, blurring the lanterns outside and turning the glass into a mirror. His reflection stared back. A man far older than his 29 years, the 11th Duke of Stonebridge, already a widower with a daughter who could find no comfort. Caroline had died 3 weeks after the birth. Childbed fever, the doctor had said, but Gideon never believed a graceful name could explain a death. Sometimes all that remained was the last moment, her hand in his, a fading smile, and her broken apology for leaving him alone with their baby girl. That moment still haunted him. He had promised to care for Grace, to be enough for two, but every night of relentless crying reminded him of everything he was not, of everything hollow inside him. Until that woman came, Evangeline Warwick. The name alone carried weight. If she was a Lord Warwick's daughter, something grave had driven her to his doorstep, drenched, barefoot, and nearly collapsing. And still, Grace had gone quiet in her arms. Gideon returned to the desk, picking up pen and paper. What he ought to write was simple: instructions to his solicitor, requesting a discreet inquiry. It was what any duke would do. It was the proper course. The pen touched the page, but when he looked down, he had written only 3 words. She made Grace sleep. He stared at the sentence as if afraid it might vanish if he blinked. A soft knock at the door pulled him back. "Come in." Mrs. Winter entered to collect the tray of tea and bread she had brought earlier. She still carried the strain of the past weeks, but there was a new lightness to her expression, as if the whole house was breathing easier. "Your Grace," she said, setting down the tray, "the young Miss Evangeline requested permission to sleep in the room beside the nursery, should little Grace wake." Gideon lifted his gaze. Most nurses demanded distance, rest, shifts, but Evangeline wanted to stay close, always close. "Grant it," he said after a pause, "and provide her with proper clothing. I can't have her in rags under this roof." The housekeeper nodded, then hesitated at the door. "Your Grace, there is something about that girl." She twisted the ring on her finger, searching for the right words. When she held little Grace, it was as if she was holding her own soul. The sentence fell between them like a stone in water, sending ripples through him that refused to fade. After Mrs. Winter left, Gideon decided to go upstairs. He climbed the staircase slowly. The corridor was still, the kind of stillness that magnifies every thought. He stopped at the door beside the nursery. It was slightly ajar. He shouldn't look. He was not a man who spied on the vulnerabilities of others. And yet his hand rested on the door, nudging it open just an inch. Evangeline sat on the edge of the bed, wrapped in a robe far too large for her. Her dark hair, still damp, fell around her shoulders. In her hands she held a torn scrap of fabric, a worn piece she stroked as if it were something sacred. She was crying, not the fear of the present, but the quiet ache of old wounds. "Michael," she whispered, barely audible. "My little Michael. Where are you?" The name struck him like a blow. He stepped back instinctively as if he had witnessed a prayer shatter. Evangeline had a child, or once had, and her loss explained everything. Back in the library, he filled his glass to the brim and drank it in one swallow, feeling the warmth of the brandy clash with the cold creeping up his hands. He sat down, staring into the fire. He had no idea what to do with this. Question her? Ignore it? Order an inquiry? Or simply let her breathe, because she was bleeding inside too. He knew only this. Evangeline Warwick was no ordinary fugitive. She was different, marked, beautiful in a way carved by sorrow. She was someone who had lost something essential, and because of that, she understood Grace as no one else seemed able to. Maybe, just maybe, Grace filled a piece of the void Michael left behind, and his own. Who would fill that? Gideon closed his eyes, trying to force the thought away. There was no room for that kind of pain, nor for that kind of hope. But when he finally went to his room, the silence didn't accuse him. For the first time in a very long while, it felt like rest. Somewhere in the early hours, sleep finally found him, and he dreamed of a voice singing in the dark, soft, sorrowful, and impossibly soothing. Chapter 3. The Routine and the Shadow. The first rays of sunlight were slipping through the window when Evangeline woke with a start. Her heart still beat as if someone had just locked a door on the other side. For a brief moment, the high ceiling, the soft bed, and the gentle air all felt as strange as a dream. Then the memories came in waves. Stonebridge Park, the gate under the rain, Grace, the lullaby. She was no longer in her father's house, no longer inside the carriage meant to deliver her to the asylum. She was safe, for now. She sat up slowly. The muscles in her legs protested, aching from the frantic run the night before. Her feet burned despite the warm water and salve Mrs. Winter had applied. She slipped into the robe left over the chair and stood. The plush carpet cushioned her steps, but it couldn't erase the memory of sharp gravel, cold mud, and blood. She walked to the window. Outside, the gardens stretched in orderly lines, packed earth paths, trimmed hedges, carefully drawn flower beds, designed for beauty, planned for peace. Nothing there resembled the narrow room where she had spent months locked away, listening to her father's calm, cruel voice, repeating that she was mad, that the baby had never existed, that everything had been a delusion. But Michael had existed. She remembered his weight in her arms, the fragile warmth against her chest, his first cry. She had counted each tiny finger. And when she woke hours later, the cradle was empty. Lord Percival Warwick had said the baby died. His words had been cold. His eyes had not. He looked away too quickly, as if hiding something. Soon after came the locks on the door. Michael was alive, somewhere, with someone. She was certain. Evangeline leaned her forehead against the cold glass. Finding him was the only thing that made sense, but for that she needed time. And time began with survival. Survival meant staying hidden, being useful, drawing no attention, becoming important enough that no one would consider sending her away, yet quiet enough that no one would dare ask too many questions. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, adjusting the robe. Mrs. Winter entered with a tray. The smell of hot tea, fresh bread, and raspberry jam filled the room, making Evangeline's stomach tighten. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten without fear. "Good morning, miss," the housekeeper greeted, setting the tray down. "Little Grace is still asleep. It's the first night in weeks she hasn't woken crying." Something tightened inside Evangeline. For everyone in this house, that silence meant rest. For her, it tasted like a borrowed miracle. Grace had slept because she sang, because for a few hours, Evangeline had stepped back into the place that had been stolen from her, the place of a mother. "I'm glad I could help," she said, and she didn't have to pretend. Mrs. Winter studied her quietly for a few seconds, as if weighing each expression, each gesture. "Miss Evangeline, forgive the impertinence," she began cautiously. "Where do you come from? Does your family know where you are?" The question had been inevitable. Evangeline's heart lurched, rising to her throat. For a moment, the room felt smaller. "If I say too much, I lose everything." "My family prefers not to have me close," she replied, her voice steady. "There were disagreements, and I chose to leave before matters worsened." "True, just not the whole truth." Mrs. Winter's expression softened, as if recognizing in those few words a kind of pain that needed no explanation. "I understand," she murmured. "In any case, His Grace asked that I provide you with proper clothing. I fetched a few dresses that belonged to—" Her gaze slipped aside, voice falling to a whisper. "The late Duchess. Everyday wear. I hope they suit you." A shiver moved down Evangeline's spine. Wearing a dead woman's dresses felt almost sacrilegious, as if stepping into a space that had not yet been emptied. But her own dress was in tatters. She had no real choice. "I appreciate your kindness," she said gently. Not long after, Mrs. Dawson returned carrying 3 folded dresses, dark blue, beige, and moss green. Good fabrics, simple cuts, made for comfort, not display. Evangeline chose the dark blue. She dressed slowly, feeling the cloth slide across newly cleaned skin. It hung a little loose at the waist. Caroline had been slightly taller, slightly fuller, but it fit well enough. In the mirror, she saw a version of herself she had nearly forgotten. Clean hair, an unsoiled face, a body clothed in something dignified. She looked like a modest gentlewoman, almost respectable. Beneath that borrowed appearance, she was still a fugitive. If her father learned where she was, he would come for her, with doctors, men he trusted, papers in hand, and this time no one would let her jump from the carriage. She braided her hair with automatic motions, pinning it in a simple coil. Then she left the room and walked down the corridor to the nursery. The door was ajar. She entered quietly. Grace lay sleeping in the carved mahogany cradle, her face peaceful, her little mouth parted in soft breaths. Tiny hands rested open over her chest. A sharp ache swept through Evangeline. Michael's absence hurt again, not like a sudden blow, but like an old scar being pressed. She approached and gently brushed her fingertips along the child's knuckles. "You are not alone," she whispered. "As long as I'm here, you are not alone." Footsteps sounded in the hallway and she straightened quickly. Turning, she found Gideon standing in the doorway. He wore riding clothes, tall boots, dark trousers, a fitted coat. Grief still marked his features, but the exhaustion seemed less overwhelming. There was a new firmness in him, as if some of the weight had shifted, if only by inches, just enough for him to breathe. For several seconds, no one spoke. His gaze went first to Grace, then to Evangeline. There was no coldness, but there was distance. It was the look of a man who had learned to assess before trusting. "She slept the entire night," he said at last, his voice low and restrained. "You have my gratitude." Evangeline bowed her head slightly. "I'm honored to help, Your Grace." Gratitude was not trust, but it was more than she'd had in a long time. "I'll be riding the grounds this morning," he continued, still lingering in the doorway. "Mrs. Winter will be nearby if you need anything. When Grace wakes, ask for milk. And—" his voice faltered, almost imperceptibly. "Sing if it's needed." "Yes, Your Grace." He seemed to consider saying something more, but simply inclined his head in a brief gesture and stepped away. His footsteps faded down the corridor, then down the stairs. A moment later, she heard the main doors open. Soft voices, the clatter of hooves in the courtyard. Finally, the sound of a horse heading down the path. Only then did she realize she'd been holding her breath. She released it slowly. As if answering the quiet, Grace stirred in the cradle. Her nose wrinkled. Her eyes opened and closed before the cry rose. Softer than the night before, but still full of a restlessness Evangeline recognized. She lifted the baby naturally, settling the small body against her chest. "Hush now, little one, I'm right here," she murmured. The old melody returned to her lips, almost without thought, a wordless lullaby woven from gentle sounds, rising and falling like a breeze. As she sang, she moved toward the window. Far beyond the trimmed gardens, she saw Gideon atop a dark horse already in the open field. His pace was not leisurely, determined, almost harsh, a man trying to outrun something that lived inside him. She understood. She was doing the same in her own way, running without moving, hiding in plain sight, surviving a past that refused to let go. With one difference, Gideon had somewhere to return. Stonebridge was his home. For Evangeline, Stonebridge was all that stood between her and the abyss. Grace's small fists relaxed, her breathing deepened, and she drifted back to sleep. Evangeline sat in a chair beside the cradle, holding the baby for a few moments longer, listening to the gentle rhythm of her breaths. There, in that quiet, she made a promise. She would do whatever it took to stay in this place. She would care for Grace as if she were her own child. She would be discreet, obedient, almost invisible, yet indispensable, until she had the strength, the means, and the chance to search for Michael, until she could, one day, be his mother again. She didn't know, and neither did he, that with every lullaby, with every night Grace's cries eased in her arms, something was beginning to form between them, something fragile, nearly unseen, just a single thread, but with time, neither of them would be able to break it. Chapter 4. The Man Who Watches. 3 weeks had passed since Evangeline Warwick had crossed the gates of Stonebridge Park, and Gideon still did not know exactly what to do with her. He only knew what he could see. Grace was thriving. It was the only word that fit. The child who had once known almost nothing but crying now at times smiled, small tentative smiles that appeared when Evangeline made a certain sound or let her fingers drift through the baby's fine, fair hair. Grace fed more easily, slept deeply, woke less afraid. In Evangeline's arms, she seemed to find a kind of peace the entire house had forgotten. That should have been enough to calm him. It should have been simple. The desperation had ended. The mansion could breathe again. And he was free to return to his usual duties, inspecting the estates, renegotiating leases, answering neglected letters, settling accounts. Work never slowed, just because a man's world had crumbled. But he couldn't simply move on. The more he watched Evangeline, the more questions arose, and Gideon Carver had always despised unanswered questions. That morning, he was in the library, bent over his ledgers, trying to force his mind to focus on numbers that kept blurring on the page when he heard it. A voice. A woman's voice. Singing. It wasn't the lullaby he already recognized, the old melody that made Grace surrender to sleep, as though someone had gently snuffed out a candle. This was another song, slower, more melancholy, with something of a prayer in it. Gideon set down the pen and went to the window. Down in the garden, Evangeline sat on a stone bench beneath the shade of an old oak. Grace slept in her lap, nestled against her chest. Evangeline sang while looking not at the child but at the horizon, as if the song were meant for someone who was not there. Her face did not speak of rest. It spoke of searching. There was a sadness there that he knew well. Not the loud sorrow of someone freshly bereaved, but the quiet kind, the one that settles on the shoulders, lodges behind the eyes, and seeps into every movement. He had seen that same sorrow in his own reflection in the months after Caroline's death. Earlier that day, Mrs. Winter had entered the library with what he had asked for, news. Not yet through formal solicitors, but through that discreet web of servants, distant relatives, and observant neighbours who always knew more than they'd ever admit. Evangeline was indeed the daughter of Lord Percival Warwick, a baron known for his severity and his lack of indulgence. That did not surprise him. What caught his attention was the silence around her name. Evangeline had left her father's house abruptly, and any mention of her came wrapped in discomfort. As if everyone knew something, but no one was willing to give it shape in words. A smothered scandal, a grave act of defiance, a break that had never healed. It was the kind of information that required some response from him. The proper course was clear. Write to Lord Warwick, inform him his daughter was at Stonebridge, inquire after his wishes, and offer to arrange her return, should he so desire. That was what the world expected of an honourable duke. Gideon returned to the desk, took a sheet of stationery and picked up his pen. He dipped the nib into the ink. The Baron's name formed easily in his mind, but the pen hovered over the page. Something held him back. Perhaps it was the way Evangeline flinched ever so slightly whenever she heard hurried footsteps in the corridor, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment and drag her away. Perhaps it was how carefully she avoided speaking of herself, sidestepping Mrs. Winter's questions with quiet skill. Perhaps it was the invisible marks of someone who had known a prison made not of iron bars, but of diagnoses and accusations. Perhaps it was her deep, guarded eyes, hiding a secret that stirred his curiosity more than it should. Or perhaps it was simply the undeniable fact that Grace needed her, and that he was not prepared to tear his daughter from the only arms that could soothe her. The pen settled back into the inkwell without ever touching the paper. Later, over dinner, a solitary meal surrounded by polished silver and empty chairs, Gideon made a decision. He finished eating by habit more than hunger, barely aware of the taste of anything. When he climbed the stairs, his feet carried him, as they did every night, to the nursery. The door was slightly ajar. He paused there for a moment, palm resting against the cool wood. Inside, Evangeline sat in the rocking chair beside the cradle. Grace slept in her arms, her cheek pressed to the fabric of Evangeline's dress. The only light came from a single candle burning on the dresser, its flame casting gentle shadows that danced along the walls. She hadn't heard him come. Her eyes were closed, and silent tears slipped down her cheeks, tracing glistening paths. Her lips moved in a murmur too soft to catch, perhaps a scrap of song, perhaps a prayer. Gideon felt a pang in his chest, the uncomfortable sense of stepping into a place that did not belong to him. Even so, he spoke. Evangeline. She jolted, her eyes flying open. She wiped the tears away with the back of her free hand, straightening in the chair as if trying in a few seconds to pull every piece of herself back into place. Your Grace, I didn't hear you come in. I noticed, he replied, stepping into the room. He clasped his hands behind his back, the old habit of a man holding tight to his composure. Is Grace well? Evangeline glanced down at the child. Yes, sir. A small, almost involuntary smile softened her features. She fed very well today. She seemed calmer. She's sleeping deeply now. He nodded. He could have left then. He didn't. He stayed, watching her. It was something he did more often than he cared to admit. looking when he thought she wouldn't notice, trying to decipher what this woman carried within her. In that chair, wearing a dress that had once belonged to the Duchess and a plain robe thrown over it, Evangeline looked fragile. But Gideon knew instinctively that there was steel beneath that softness. No one fled from whatever she had fled without a considerable reserve of strength. Before he could reconsider, the question slipped out. "Why do you cry?" She went still, as if the very air between them had thickened. The gentle creak of the rocking chair suddenly seemed too loud. Her fingers tightened in the fabric of her skirt. "Because she reminds me of someone," she answered at last, barely above a whisper. "Who?" The word came quiet, but direct. Silence filled the small room, heavy and close. Evangeline drew a slow breath. When she spoke, it was as if she pulled the words from somewhere painfully deep. "Someone I lost, someone I should have protected, and couldn't." Gideon stepped a little closer. He remembered that first night, the half-open door, her broken whisper in the dark. Michael. This was no discovery now, only confirmation. "Your child," he said calmly. Her eyes lifted to his, widening for an instant. There was fear there, and borrowed shame, and an old, raw grief. She didn't answer aloud. She didn't need to. He moved back half a step, giving her space. "You don't have to tell me what happened," he added, his voice lower. "Not now, if you'd rather not. But I want you to know this. As long as Grace needs you, you will have a place here. Whatever lies behind you is no one else's concern for the time being." Evangeline looked at him as though she were not entirely sure she had heard correctly. "Why?" she breathed. "Why would you do that for me? I'm a stranger in this house. You have no reason to trust me." He could have said it was only for Grace, that every choice he made was rooted in his daughter's safety. It would have been true, but not the whole truth. "Because I recognize someone who's running," he replied after a moment. "And because, whatever you're running from, it doesn't seem to me that you deserve to be hunted." The words hung between them, heavy with something he did not care to examine too closely. Evangeline looked away, but not before he saw the faint tremor in her shoulders. She held Grace a little tighter, as if the child were the only thing keeping her anchored to that spot. "Thank you," she whispered. Gideon inclined his head in a brief nod and left the room. In the corridor, he rested his hand against the doorframe for a few seconds, turning the conversation over in his mind. He realized, with a clarity that unsettled him, that he was beginning to care too much. Not just for his daughter, that was inevitable, but for the woman who held her as if the whole world were in her arms. For the woman who cried in silence so as not to wake anyone. For the woman who sang to chase away ghosts he couldn't see, but could feel hovering around her. He walked to his own room, lay back, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to trace the exact moment when Evangeline had stopped being merely a useful stranger and become something else, something he could not yet name. Something that edged dangerously close to need. Men like him knew how to manage numbers, leases, harvests, protocol. They could handle, to a point, the weight of grief. But a woman under his roof, carrying secrets that echoed his own, bearing a pain that spoke the same silent language as his, that was of another order entirely. And as the house breathed in quiet around him, Gideon knew, though he would not admit it even to himself, that it was already too late to pull back. Evangeline was here. Grace needed her, and he was beginning to need her too. Perhaps that was the greatest danger of all. Chapter 5. Sharing Ghosts. Autumn had arrived at Stonebridge Park like a whisper. The edges of the leaves were just beginning to yellow. The morning air carried a cold sharpness that nipped at the skin, and a soft mist lay over the fields before dissolving in the sun. It had been 2 months since Evangeline had come to Stonebridge, 2 months that made her, with each passing day, a little safer, and because of that, a little more guilty. Safe, because no one had come for her. No letter bearing the Warwick crest, no messenger, no servant sent in haste with orders. It was as if she had been erased by her own family, or, as the thought sometimes came, cold as a blade, as if Lord Percival were simply waiting for the right moment to act. Guilty because she was beginning to grow attached. To Grace, most of all. to the loose, sleepy smiles in the morning, the tiny fist that curled around her finger, the way the baby nestled against her chest as if she recognized it as a harbor. To Mrs. Winter, who no longer asked questions and now offered tea and quiet counsel with a reserved affection. To the muted routine of the house, the corridors Evangeline had learned to walk almost in the dark. To the feeling, still strange, still dangerous, of waking without instant panic. And in a way she did not dare name, to Gideon. He remained a reserved man, made more of silences than words. But sometimes Evangeline would find him standing at the nursery door, watching his daughter sleep. In those moments, the Duke vanished. Only a father remained, vulnerable, exhausted, with his whole heart chained to that child. She understood. She hid her own wounds behind a discreet smile and a song. That morning, after feeding Grace and changing her clothes, Evangeline took her out to the garden. The wicker pram, recently purchased, rolled smoothly over the gravel path. Grace watched the movement of the leaves with wide, intent eyes, as though seeing the world for the first time. That was when Evangeline saw him. Gideon stood near the lake, beneath the willow tree. He wore no formal coat, just a white shirt and dark waistcoat, his sleeves rolled up. His shoulders were slightly bowed, the posture of someone carrying a weight even the fresh air could not lift. Evangeline thought of turning away, giving him space. But Grace let out a bright, babbling sound, and Gideon raised his head. Their eyes met. He looked surprised but not displeased. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, stopping at a respectful distance. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he replied, stepping closer. His gaze dropped as it always did to his daughter. "She likes the garden." "She does," Evangeline agreed, a smile rising before she could stop it. "And so do I. There's something peaceful here." Gideon nodded, but the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It hung between them, suspended, as if neither quite knew what to do with their own vulnerability. He was the one who broke it. "My wife used to come here," he said softly. "Caroline. She would sit on that bench." He motioned to the stone bench near the shore. "She said the sound of the water calmed her." Evangeline pictured the Duchess there, young, gentle, with dreams that perhaps no one had ever truly listened to. "I'm sorry for your loss, Your Grace," she said, simple and sincere. "So am I." Gideon drew a deeper breath. "Though not in the way I suppose I should be. Caroline and I, we were not one of those passionate couples novels insist on describing. It was an arrangement between families. There was respect, even a kind of fondness, but no ardor." Evangeline heard the stripped honesty in his voice, the sort of truth no one expected from a duke. "It must still hurt," she murmured. "Losing her." "It hurts because she deserved more," he answered. "She deserved to be chosen for love. She deserved to laugh more. And it hurts." His voice dropped. "Because Grace will never know her. She won't know her mother sang off-key but sang anyway. That she was patient, that she was good." Evangeline felt her chest tighten. "She can still know," she said, the words leaving before she could measure them. "If you tell her. What made her smile? What annoyed her? What she loved? Memory is a way of loving too." Gideon looked at her, truly looked, as if he had not expected to hear that from anyone. Then, more quietly, almost intimately, "And you?" he asked. "The child you lost, do you keep his memory alive?" The name formed before she decided to allow it. "Every day," she whispered. "I think of him every day. Michael. I held him for only a few hours before my father, before they took him." Gideon straightened slightly, as if struck by something unseen. "Took him?" he repeated, not in judgment, only seeking to understand. Evangeline's hand tightened around the handle of the pram, as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "My father said he died." The words came slow, heavy, but I know it's a lie, from the haste, from the way he looked away, from the silence that followed. I know Michael is alive, somewhere, with someone, and I don't know where. For a moment, only the sound of the water moving on the lake filled the space between them. Gideon did not offer easy comfort. He did not rush to answers. He simply stepped a little closer, just enough for her to feel that she was not alone inside that ache. His hand lifted slowly, hesitant, and came to rest on her shoulder. The touch was light, respectful, and yet it warmed. Evangeline did not pull away. "That's why you care for Grace like this," he said, not asking, stating. She kept her eyes on the water, where the light broke into scattered gold. "Because when I hold her, Michael feels less far away," she admitted. "I know it isn't right. It isn't fair to your daughter. But sometimes it's the only way I can stay upright." She braced herself for reproach, for hard logic, for distance. What came instead was steady reassurance. "It isn't unfair," Gideon said. "Grace is better because you're with her. She isn't being used. She's being loved. And you—" He paused, searching for the words. "You have a right to that as well, to be a mother, even if only on loan." Evangeline turned slowly toward him. His face was serious, but not closed. It was the face of a man who understood loss, and who recognized her pain as kin to his own. "Thank you," she managed, "for letting me stay, for not condemning me." He let his hand fall from her shoulder with quiet care, and offered a half-smile that reached only part of his eyes. "I've no moral authority to condemn anyone, Miss Warwick," he said. "We all carry ghosts. Some of them are simply louder than others." They remained there a while longer, side by side, watching the water. Grace babbled softly to herself, fascinated with her own foot. A sweetness so piercing it almost hurt. There were no promises, no confessions, only a quiet understanding, as if, for a brief moment, two separate griefs had found the same center. As Evangeline walked away, guiding the pram along the path, she glanced back over her shoulder. Gideon still stood beneath the willow, hands in his pockets, watching her until she vanished around the curve. For the first time in many months, when she thought of Michael, Evangeline did not feel only the dry, cutting pain of loss. There was something else threaded through it, a faint note of hope that if she ever found him, perhaps she would not be entirely alone. And before she could stop it, that perhaps took on Gideon Carver's face. The thought warmed her and frightened her deeply. Because trusting was always this, reaching out a hand knowing it might one day return empty. And Evangeline Warwick had already lost more than she believed she could bear. Chapter 6. Between Duty and Desire. Gideon could not get her out of his mind. The account books lay open in front of him. A stack of letters waited for replies, but he had been staring at the same column of numbers for far too long. The figures blurred together, rearranging themselves into the same image over and over. Evangeline. The way she tilted her head when she sang to Grace. The rare, unguarded laugh when the baby managed some small mischief. The way she held the child, with absolute gentleness, and at the same time, a fierce attachment that betrayed someone who had already lost more than she could bear. It wasn't her beauty. He had learned to recognize beauty early, at balls, at dinners, through endless London seasons. It was the mix of strength and fragility. The way she always seemed to be bracing for a blow, a bell rung at the wrong time, an unexpected visitor, any small interruption that might destroy everything. There was a story there. He knew it. And more troubling than that, he knew he had been looking for excuses to cross her path during the day. He slammed the ledger shut. This had to stop. He was a duke. He had land, accounts, tenants, a title that could not be steered by confused feelings toward a woman who had appeared without a single clear reference. He rose and went to the window. Outside, Evangeline was spreading a blanket over the still damp grass. Grace, propped up between pillows, laughed as she tried to grab her own feet. Evangeline leaned over her, her face lit with a simple, unguarded pride. It was an ordinary scene, and at the same time, perfect. Except for one detail, she was not Grace's mother. Yet watching them like that, Gideon realized she could be. That the picture made a painfully deep kind of sense, as if, for a few minutes, the world had finally slid into its rightful place. He stepped back from the window as if he had come too close to something dangerous. Back at the desk, he reached for the letters. The scarlet wax seal stamped with the Ashton crest caught his eye. He broke it open. Lord Ashton wrote with the polished courtesy of a practiced earl, wishes of good health, old references, a respectful mention of Gideon's widowhood, and finally the suggestion. A visit to Stonebridge, with his wife and daughter, Lady Catherine, now of an age to consider marriage. It made sense, it was almost inevitable. A young widower, with an infant heiress, a solid title, extensive properties. Lady Catherine, of good family, properly brought up, suitable in every way. The kind of union the world expected. He should accept, prepare the house. Do what everyone would call the natural next step. But when he tried to picture Lady Catherine at the Stonebridge table or approaching Grace in the nursery, the image simply would not form. There was an empty space where her face should have been. In its place he saw only Evangeline. He dipped his pen into the ink and began his reply. He thanked Lord Ashton for the honour, regretted that due to his recent bereavement and his daughter's need for stability, he could not receive visitors at present. He asked for understanding. He left the door open for some future occasion. It was reasonable. It was true. It simply failed to mention that more than mourning, what held him back was his refusal to see another woman step into a place that, without any title at all, Evangeline had begun to fill. When the butler carried the sealed letter away, Gideon sent word for his horse to be saddled. He needed to ride. The cold wind cut across his face as he crossed the land. For a while, the steady rhythm of the gallop helped quiet his thoughts. But they always circled back to the same point. Evangeline in the garden, Evangeline in the nursery, Evangeline slipping into the library with a book in her hands, as if, even then, she were asking permission to exist in that room. When he returned, his body tired, he found her in the hall. She was pale, her fingers laced together so tightly the knuckles whitened, fear plain in her eyes. "Your Grace." Her voice was taut. "Grace has a fever." Nothing else mattered. He took the stairs 2 at a time. In the nursery, Grace lay in her cradle, her little face flushed, eyes half closed, a thin whimper escaping her now and then. Mrs. Winter stood beside her with a basin of cool water and cloths. "It began about 2 hours ago, sir," she said anxiously. "I've already sent for the physician." Gideon touched his daughter's forehead. The heat made him pull his hand back, his stomach churning. Fever. Fever again. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to tilt. The memory of Caroline, the unbearable heat, his helplessness, the bedroom that would never be the same, rose like a ghost. "No," he murmured under his breath, more to himself than to the others. "Not again." Evangeline stepped closer with another basin, fresh cloths ready. "We'll keep her cool," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her lips. "Little ones get sudden fevers. It's frightening, but often it passes. Cool compresses, small sips of water. Until the doctor arrives, that's what we can do." He looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in the room. "Are you sure?" She drew a breath. "No." She did not try to lie. "But I know what to do until someone is more certain than I am." And that was what they did. For hours the world shrank to that room, Grace in his arms, then in Evangeline's careful hold, cloths that cooled and warmed too quickly, Mrs. Dawson renewing the water, cracking the window to just the right point between fresh air and chill. By the time the doctor arrived, the sky was already darkening. He examined the child calmly, listened to her chest, felt her gums. 7 months, is that right?" he asked. "Yes," Gideon answered. "Teething. A mild infant fever," the man declared, his tone assured. "Continue as you are. Watch her. If it worsens or doesn't break, send for me again. But for now, I see no cause for alarm." At the word alarm, Gideon realized just how close he had been to it. When the physician left, he needed to sit down. Still, he did not leave the nursery. He took the chair beside the cradle. Evangeline sat in the other. Mrs. Winter, after bringing tea and checking the shutters, slipped out quietly, promising to return at intervals. The candlelight cast a soft glow, shadows swaying along the walls. Grace's breathing had slowed. She was still hot, but no longer burning. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough. "So should you," Evangeline replied, without taking her eyes off Grace. He watched her. Strands of hair had fallen loose around her face, which was lined with fatigue, but held a stubborn calm he envied. There was a quiet bravery in her that didn't come from ignorance of danger, but from long familiarity with it. "Thank you," he murmured, "for not losing your head when I couldn't think at all." She turned away for a moment, as if the weight of those words were almost too much to bear. "She'll be all right," she said, with a certainty he chose to accept. "She will," he echoed. Silence returned, not the hollow silence of an empty house weeks before, but one full of breaths and unspoken things. Without planning it, he spoke. "I don't want you to leave." Evangeline's head snapped up, surprise flickering clear and bright. "Your Grace, Gideon," he corrected more quietly. "When we're alone, call me Gideon." She hesitated, as if stepping over some invisible line. "Gideon." She tested the name barely above a whisper. "I have no intention of leaving, unless you wish me to go." He shook his head. "I don't." A beat. "Grace needs you." He could have stopped there. Let the words rest under the safe cover of responsibility. But Gideon had grown tired of pretending he felt nothing more. "And he added, not daring to meet her eyes, "I've realized I've grown used to having you here." Evangeline seemed to hold her breath. It was not entirely unexpected, but it was still more than she'd imagined he would say. "Used to me?" "In what way?" she asked, her voice soft, almost afraid of the answer. He hesitated, just long enough for her to sense that there was more beneath his words than he was willing to confess. "Enough that I notice when you're not there," he said at last, "and that is not something I anticipated." She closed her eyes slowly, as if absorbing something too delicate to touch all at once. "I understand," she whispered, and she did, but there was fear there too. "Sometimes I feel the same, and it confuses me." Grace stirred in the cradle, letting out a restless sigh. Gideon and Evangeline leaned forward at the same moment instinctively, the same concern guiding them. The small dim room seemed to hold more than two adults watching over a sick child. It held something forming between them, subtle, inevitable, born from duty, from shared fear, from the nearness of everyday life. As he watched Evangeline gently smooth the blanket over Grace, Gideon understood, not in words but in feeling, that whatever he felt for her had already moved beyond gratitude or convenient arrangement. It was something that lived in the quiet spaces, something that from that night on would force him to reconsider every decision about his future, and Grace's. Because, whether he wanted it or not, Evangeline already had a place within him, not just in the house, but in some deeper room he did not yet dare to name. Chapter 7. The Weight of the Heart. Winter had come hard to Stonebridge Park. Snow lay over the gardens like a white mantle, erasing paths and softening edges. To many, the estate would have looked like something out of a fairy tale. For Evangeline, everything that mattered was inside the house. The warmth of the fireplaces, Grace's cries, laughter and bubbling sounds, the rhythm of familiar footsteps. A deep voice that, for reasons she could not explain, calmed storms inside her. 4 months had passed since she had stood at those gates, drenched and desperate. Grace was nearly 8 months old now, round and rosy, crawling clumsily, trying to turn sounds into words. Evangeline's days revolved around her, feeding, changing, singing, scattering little objects over the rug so curious hands could discover the world. And Gideon. Gideon was always, in some way, close, never improperly. In front of others he kept the proper distance, but Evangeline noticed him in the details. Every morning before breakfast he stopped by the nursery, kissed his daughter's forehead, and gave a small nod as if blessing the day. Sometimes he appeared in the garden at the exact moment she was pushing the pram, quietly offering to take over. At night, the door of the library stayed slightly ajar, and she knew he listened from below when her voice rose with the lullaby that sent Grace to sleep. Little by little, a truth settled over her, no matter how she tried to push it away. She was falling in love with Gideon Carver. It hadn't been lightning or a grand gesture. It had grown slowly, like ivy on an old wall. One day it was only a timid strand. Before she knew it, it had taken root everywhere. And that was dangerous. She was a fugitive, with a past that any London drawing room would call scandalous. A child out of wedlock, a father willing to call her mad, months locked away. She had no name she could speak without fear. He was a duke. He needed an irreproachable wife from a family beyond reproach. Evangeline repeated these truths like a rosary. Her heart, however, seemed unimpressed. That December afternoon, snow was falling thick outside. Grace slept in the nursery under Mrs. Winter's watchful eye for a few minutes. Evangeline, a book in hand, the one she had finished the night before, was on her way downstairs to the library when voices from the hall made her stop. One of them was Gideon's, the other. The book slipped from her fingers. That voice. Deep, cutting. The same voice that had once declared her hysterical, that had denied the existence of his grandson, that had ordered keys to turn in locks. Lord Percival Warwick, her father. The blood seemed to drain from her body. For a moment, she thought she might faint. He had found her. Her first instinct was to run back up the stairs, snatch Grace from the cradle, search for a side door, vanish into the snow. But her feet did not move. Something in her, perhaps the part that was exhausted from running, kept her there. Breathing with difficulty, she moved toward the corridor that overlooked the hall and peered down. Below, Warwick stood in the center of the entrance hall. Tall, ramrod straight, in a perfectly tailored dark coat, silk waistcoat, gloves in hand. Beside him, two men with hard expressions. Facing them, Gideon, back straight, arms folded, his eyes colder than she was used to seeing them. "Lord Warwick," he was saying, courteous but chilled, "I understand your concern, but there is no one at Stonebridge who matches the description you've given me. With all due respect, Your Grace, my men obtained reliable information." Warwick's voice was calm. The anger lurked beneath it. Evangeline knew that tone too well. "My daughter, Evangeline, was seen in this region. She is unstable. She fled the medical care I arranged, mentally fragile. She had to grab the wall to stay upright." "Evangeline," Gideon repeated slowly, as if fitting pieces of a puzzle together. Warwick adopted the perfect mask of wounded fatherly concern. "My poor daughter suffered a collapse after certain unfortunate circumstances. She clings to fantasies, invents stories. She is a danger to herself. I must take her back so she may receive proper treatment." "You refer to an asylum?" Gideon asked, the word heavy. "To a specialized house, yes." Warwick's tone bordered on compassionate. "It is not an easy decision for a father, but when a mind strays from reality, one must intervene. Whatever tale she has told Your Grace is a symptom of her illness." From the staircase, Evangeline saw doubt flicker across Gideon's face. It hurt more than any insult. "If she were here," he said, "what would you expect me to do?" "Return her to my care, of course." Warwick inclined his head. "I am her father. I have the duty and the right to decide what is best for her." "And if she did not wish to go," Gideon pressed, "that would only confirm the diagnosis." Warwick did not hesitate. "The law grants fathers and husbands authority to act on behalf of those who lack full reason. The trap was perfect. If she resisted, it proved madness. If she yielded, she was locked away again." Gideon fell silent. His shoulders tightened. It was then Evangeline realized that if she stayed hidden, she would condemn herself to her father's version of the truth for the rest of her life. She stepped away from the safety of the wall and descended the last flight of stairs. "I'm here." The words cut through the air. Three heads turned at once. Warwick smiled, a smile of triumph, not affection. Gideon paled slightly. The two men at the Baron's side moved forward, but the Duke lifted a hand. "No one moves," he said, without needing to raise his voice. "Evangeline—" The way Gideon said her name held relief and worry tangled together. "Let me—" "No." She cut him off, not looking at him yet. "I have to say this myself." He nodded and stepped aside, giving her space. Evangeline turned to her father. "I'm not mad," she said, each syllable dragged up from somewhere deep. "And everything I'm about to say is true, no matter how you try to tear it apart afterward." "Evangeline, my dear, you are unwell," Warwick began, all softness. Silence. Gideon's voice sliced through. "You will speak when I permit it, Lord Warwick." The Baron's eyes darkened, but he obeyed. Evangeline drew a breath. Her hands shook. She laced them together. She began to tell her story. She spoke of David Farrow, the lieutenant with a worn uniform and steady smile. Of hidden letters, of a secret pregnancy. Of the elderly maid who had helped her through the birth. Of the hoarse cry of her newborn son. "I held Michael in my arms for only a few hours," she went on, her voice wavering. "I saw his face. I counted his fingers. Then I fainted." She swallowed. "When I woke, the cradle was empty. My father told me the baby had died. But I saw his eyes. I saw how quickly he ordered that I be locked away, how he summoned doctors to declare me unbalanced. Michael was alive. He had him taken." "Delusion," Warwick snapped. "There was never any child. This fantasy about a soldier—" "Then why did you lock me up?" she asked, turning to him. "Why isolate me for months with no visitors? Why bring doctors? Why send me to an institution? If there was nothing to hide, why work so hard to shut me away?" For a moment, Warwick seemed to search for an answer, and chose not to offer one. Evangeline turned back to Gideon. "I escaped from the carriage that was taking me there," she continued, her voice softer. "I jumped, fell in the mud, tore my feet. I ran until I no longer knew where I was. Then I saw the gates of Stonebridge. I begged for help. You let me in." Tears she had held back for so long finally spilled over. "I know my presence here causes trouble. I know my past is stained in the eyes of the world, but everything I've told you is true. If you can believe me just a little longer, I promise I'll find a way to leave without dragging your name through the mud." The silence that followed felt endless. Gideon studied her for a long time. Evangeline could see the battle in his face, the weight of Warwick's accusations, what he knew of her, his sense of duty, the urge to protect. Then he moved. He stepped forward and placed himself between her and her father, a living barrier. "She stays." The two words rang through the hall. Warwick stiffened. "Your Grace, I do not think you grasp the implications. I understand that a father willing to imprison his daughter in an asylum is not a reliable source," Gideon replied, voice like ice. "I understand that she has cared for my child with more tenderness than any nurse I could hire. And I understand that as of this moment, you are no longer welcome at Stonebridge." "You are placing yourself in a delicate position," Warwick growled. "That woman is a liar, Careful." Gideon stepped closer. "Every insult you throw at a woman under my protection, you throw at me. And if you insist, I will not hesitate to have you removed, title or no title." Warwick flickered between rage and calculation. He could not afford a direct feud with a duke. At last he rebuilt his mask. "This is not finished," he said coldly. "She is still my daughter. The law grants me rights over her." Gideon inclined his head slightly. "Rights that cease to exist when she becomes the legal responsibility of another." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Evangeline's feet. Warwick understood as well, and went pale with fury. "You would not dare!" "Try me," Gideon said, humorless. After one last glance at his daughter, thick with venom, Warwick turned on his heel and left, his men following. The door closed with a contained boom. Suddenly, the hall felt far too large. Evangeline's knees gave way. Gideon caught her before she fell. She clung to his coat like someone afraid of being dragged back into a nightmare. "You believed me," she managed between sobs. "Why?" He eased her back just enough to see her face. "Because I know you," he answered hoarsely. "Not everything you've lived through, but enough to know you're telling the truth, and to tell the difference between someone fighting to be heard and someone trying to silence her." But he spoke with such certainty. Her voice trembled. For a moment even I doubted myself. "You're not mad, Evangeline," he said, steady and sure. "You're brave, and as long as you're under this roof, he will not take you back." She cried then, out of fear, relief, Exhaustion. He simply held her, his chin resting lightly on her hair. When the tears subsided, she pulled back a little. "What did you mean?" she whispered. "About rights that cease to exist." Gideon hesitated. "I spoke on impulse," he admitted, "but it wasn't an empty thought. There is a legal way to sever his authority over you." He drew a long breath. "If you were my wife, Warwick would lose the power he claims. You would have my name, my house, my protection. You would be the Duchess of Stonebridge, and under the law, he would have no claim over you." The words hung there, heavy and irreversible. Evangeline felt the world shift. "Marry you," she murmured. "That's madness." A brief half-smile touched his lips. "Perhaps." His eyes, however, were completely serious. "But it is not charity. I want you here, for myself, for Grace. You don't have to answer now." Michael's name rose in her mind like a prayer. "And him," she whispered. "My son. I can't think of any future without at least trying to find him." "Then we begin with him," Gideon replied without the slightest pause. "I have means to search in places you never could. If he is alive, I will do everything in my power to bring him back to you. Whether you marry me or not." Her eyes flooded again, this time with a different kind of emotion. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because I want to protect you," he said simply, "and because no one should be denied the chance to find their own child." Evangeline could not answer. She let her forehead rest against his chest. Gideon wrapped his arms around her once more. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and steady. Inside Stonebridge, for the first time in a very long while, Evangeline felt that the ghost at the door had been kept out, and that whatever weight lay ahead, she would no longer carry it alone. Chapter 8. The Price of the Choice. Gideon did not sleep that night. He stayed in the library until dawn, watching the embers sink into ash while Lord Warwick's last words echoed in his mind. "When this turns against you, remember I warned you." It hadn't been a bluff. Warwick was influential enough to poison clubs, dinners and drawing rooms all over London. If he could no longer control his daughter with locks and iron, he would try to do it with whispers. He would turn Evangeline into a cautionary tale, mad, fallen, dangerous, and pull Stonebridge down with her if he could. Yet the longer Gideon stared into the fading fire, the less that threat frightened him. Out in the hall in front of her and her father, he had said out loud what he had only dared admit in silence for weeks. He wanted Evangeline there. He was willing to bind his name to hers. If he had to, he would make her his wife and tear her once and for all from her father's authority. There was no going back. And for the first time since Caroline's death, the irreversibility of a decision did not feel like a prison. It felt like relief. He loved Evangeline. The woman who cradled his daughter with fierce tenderness, who wept for a little boy the world called a delusion, who, shaking before her own father, had still chosen to speak. Caroline had been a good wife, and he would never dishonor her memory. But what he felt for Evangeline was of another nature, deeper, barer, more dangerous, the kind of thing he had once dismissed as romantic exaggeration, and that now had a very real face. As the first grey light began to creep through the windows, Gideon rose. There were things to be done. He started with letters. The first, to his solicitor in London, requested an urgent investigation into a male child, roughly 1 year old, possibly placed in an orphanage or with a family through an arrangement tied to the name Warwick. He offered generous payment in exchange for the utmost discretion. The second, to a trusted informant, called for a careful survey of Lord Percival Warwick. Properties, debts, associations, enemies, habits. If Warwick wanted war, Gideon had no intention of waging it blind. The third letter demanded more care. Addressed to the church authorities, it requested a dispensation for a shortened engagement, mentioning only delicate circumstances that recommended haste. It did not descend into detail. It invoked, with restrained formality, the weight of the Stonebridge title as guarantee of seriousness. He reread, sealed them, and handed all 3 to the butler with orders for immediate dispatch. Only then did he go upstairs. He found Evangeline in the nursery. Grace, on the rug, was shaking a silver rattle and laughing every time it made a louder sound. Evangeline, in the rocking chair, looked as though she had cried. There were shadows under her eyes, but something in her posture had changed. She seemed less folded in on herself, as if, despite the fear, being believed had lifted an old weight. When she saw him in the doorway, she rose almost at once. "Good morning," she said, her voice small. "Good morning," he replied, stepping into the room. Grace stretched her arms out to him with a happy squeal. He lifted her, kissed her forehead as he did every morning, but the gesture felt both familiar and strangely new. "Did you manage to sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not much. I kept thinking about everything." He pulled a chair closer and sat facing her. "And did you reach any conclusion you'd like to throw at me before I speak?" he ventured, a hint of dry humor in his tone. A faint smile flickered across her face and vanished. "I did reach one," she admitted. "I'm afraid. Afraid you spoke on impulse. That now the night is over, you'll regret it." Gideon set Grace back in her lap and went down on one knee, so their eyes were level. "It wasn't impulse," he said calmly. "The thought of having you here as more than the woman who cares for Grace has been growing for a long time. Last night only forced me to say it out loud." She watched him, holding the baby close. "But your Grace—" He stopped her with a small gesture. "Please call me Gideon. I want you to know that since you arrived," he went on, "this house has felt like a home again. Grace is flourishing with you, and in ways I was too slow to see, so am I." Tears sprang to her eyes. "I don't know if I deserve that." "It isn't your father who decides what you deserve," he answered with a gentle firmness, "and I have no intention of following his judgment." Grace chose that moment to grab a lock of Evangeline's hair, making her yelp softly. They both laughed. For a heartbeat, the tension loosened. When the laughter faded, Gideon continued, "I've already written to my lawyer. The search for Michael began this morning. If there are records, someone will find them. And if he's in a good place, I won't tear him out of it the way they did with you. But I will do everything I can to be sure he knows who his mother is, so that one day he can choose." Evangeline bit her lower lip. "And if he's happy? If he's loved?" "I'm afraid of being nothing more than another storm in his life." "Maybe you will be," he conceded, "but a storm that brings truth. He'll grow up. One day he'll want to know where he came from. You'll be able to look at him without lies." She nodded slowly. "I've also written to the church," he added. "I asked for permission to marry sooner than custom allows. If all goes well, in a few weeks you'll bear my name. And Warwick will find a much higher wall in his way." Evangeline closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, relief and fear were tangled together there. "There will be questions," she murmured, "about why you chose someone like me." "We'll say what's needed," he replied, "that you're Lord Warwick's daughter, that there were disagreements, that you came to Stonebridge to care for Grace, and that we fell in love. The rest is no one's concern." She drew in a careful breath. "And Michael, when we find him, he'll be acknowledged as your son," Gideon said without hesitation, "and my stepson. He won't be shut away in any corner of this house." The tears returned, now shaded with something else. Grace yawned. Evangeline laid her in the cradle, tucked the blankets around her, hummed a couple of notes without really thinking. When she turned back, Gideon was still watching her. "There's something I didn't tell you completely," she began, taking her seat again. "About David. Michael's father." "I want to hear it," was all he said. Her gaze dropped to the rug. "Lieutenant David Farrow." A small, wistful smile brushed her lips. "No fortune, no title. But he had a kind of honesty you can't buy. With him I stopped being Lord Warwick's daughter. I was just myself." She spoke of meeting him first in crowded rooms, then in gardens, of promises, of his proposal, of their plan to run away when he returned from war, and of how the news of his death had arrived 3 months before Michael was born. Gideon felt that familiar pull of recognition. Loss knew its own kind. "I'm sorry," he said, and it was not an empty phrase. "I thought my heart had died with him," she confessed. "Later that it had died for good when my father took Michael from me. I didn't think I could ever—" She searched his eyes. "Feel anything like this again?" He moved closer and took her hand between both of his. "Caroline will always have a place in my memory," he said quietly. "But my heart now." He gave her fingers a gentle squeeze. "It's here." For a few seconds, they simply shared the same breath. Then Gideon stood. "There is one more thing I have to do," he said, "and I don't want to delay it." He asked her to come with him to the library. There he opened a locked drawer and took out a small blue velvet box. "I won't pretend I don't know your answer," he said, a half smile tugging at his mouth. "But some things deserve to be done properly." He opened the box. Inside lay a ring set with a deep blue sapphire, encircled by small diamonds. It was not Caroline's ring. Evangeline noticed that, and a little of the stiffness in her shoulders eased. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "She used to say this stone carried the color of loyalty and of truth." He lifted his eyes to Evangeline. "It seems fitting." He took her hand. "Evangeline Warwick," he said solemnly, "will you allow me to make you my wife? Not out of obligation or whim, but because I want you here. Because I want to share this house, this child, and God willing the one who is still missing, with you." The yes came almost as a breath, but it was enough. The ring slid onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Evangeline looked down at her hand, at the sapphire's soft gleam, and felt something anchor inside her. Not just hope, but a promise she was making as much as he was. Later that same day, Gideon had the servants gathered in the main hall. Mrs. Winter, the butler, maids, gardeners, the coachman, they arranged themselves as best they could. Evangeline stood to Gideon's right, pale and straight-backed, the ring clearly visible. "I have an announcement," he said. "In the coming weeks, Miss Evangeline Warwick will become my wife and the Duchess of Stonebridge." There was a heartbeat of silence. Then Mrs. Winter pressed her hands to her chest and began to applaud, smiling openly. The others followed, some with enthusiasm, others more cautiously. But no one dared object. "I trust," Gideon added, "that you will all treat her with the respect due to her future position, and with the same kindness you've already shown her." In the corridor afterward, Mrs. Winter caught Evangeline's hands, her eyes shining. "I won't say I always knew," she murmured, "but I suspected. The little one will have a mother who loves her, and His Grace." She shot a quick glance toward the library. "He needed someone to remind him he's still alive." "I don't know if I deserve so much," Evangeline replied, her voice thick. "No one here gives a fig for what Lord Warwick thinks you deserve," the housekeeper said briskly. "You brought laughter back into this house. That's already the work of a duchess." That night, with Grace asleep, they returned to the library. Gideon slipped an arm around Evangeline's waist, drawing her gently closer. "From now on," he said, half serious, half amused, "we'll have quite a task ahead of us. Letters to answer, visits to decline, banns to arrange, elderly ladies to scandalize with that ring, and in the middle of it all, the most important work of all, finding Michael." Evangeline rested her head on his shoulder. "And facing my family," she added quietly. "Your family," he corrected, "is this one now." He pulled her a little nearer. "If Lord Warwick insists, we'll deal with him together." She gave a small, crooked smile. The fear hadn't vanished. She knew her father. Men like him did not yield easily. The battle was only just beginning. But for the first time, when she pictured the future, she did not see herself alone in a dark room or running down a muddy road. She saw Grace. She saw a boy who still needed to be found. She saw a man willing to stand between her and whatever came. The price of this choice would be high. But feeling the weight of the sapphire on her finger and Gideon's arm firm around her, Evangeline knew she would pay it, and that unlike so many decisions forced upon her, this one at last was hers. Chapter 9. Between Past and Future. Spring of 1845 settled over Stonebridge Park like a late-coming balm. The cherry trees bloomed early that year, filling the air with drifting pink petals that scattered across the gravel paths. The light scent of daffodils and tulips seemed to slip into every room of the house. Evangeline breathed that new air with the strange feeling of being someone else. There were no sudden jolts at footsteps in the corridor, no key turning on the other side of a door, no looming shadow cast by her father's figure. Now the marble halls echoed with a different kind of sound, Grace's laughter. At 2 years old, Grace moved through Stonebridge Park with the fearless energy of a child who had never learned to be afraid. Dark hair, inherited from Gideon, fell in soft curls around her shoulders. Her eyes, blue like Caroline's, burned with a charm that was entirely her own. She ran between the columns of the great hall, while Gideon pretended to be a wild horse thundering after her. "Faster, Papa!" she shouted between peals of laughter. Evangeline watched them, smiling, proud, content, and pierced by a small, stubborn pang of guilt, because there was another name that never left her: Michael. The search for him had begun long before the wedding, when there had been more pain than hope. From the start, Gideon had men working in London, Kent, Sussex, Yorkshire, anywhere quiet adoptions might take place. There were rumours, incomplete records, contradictory testimonies, and each lead in the end dissolved like mist in sunlight. The first months had been the cruelest. With every letter received, Evangeline held her breath. With every envelope that carried no answer, her heart came apart a little more. Gideon saw, he always saw, what she tried to hide. He never promised miracles, but he never let her drown. "We will find him," he would say with quiet conviction. "I don't know when. But I know we won't give up." But a year passed, then 2, and the more Grace grew in her arms, the more a silent question throbbed inside her. Who holds Michael when he cries? Who whispers songs to help him sleep? Somewhere, does he feel the lack of something he has never known he lost? In the stillness of the night, those questions tore at her. By day, she stood upright, for Grace, for Gideon, for herself. In the winter of 1846, a letter changed everything, though not in the way she expected. It came from Warwick Hall, written by a distant cousin. Lord Percival Warwick, it said, had suffered a severe apoplexy. He had survived, but with significant loss of speech and movement. He was confined to a chair, dependent, and above all, incapable of harming anyone again. Evangeline read the letter in front of the library fire and did not shed a single tear. "Are you all right?" Gideon asked, sitting beside her. It took her a while to answer. "I thought I'd feel relief," she admitted softly. "I thought there would be justice. But all I feel is empty. As if I spent so long being afraid that now it's over, I don't know what to do with what's left." Gideon took her hands. "He can't reach you anymore," he said. "Not you, not our children." She nodded and rested her forehead against his. "But Michael," she whispered. "He's still lost." "We're searching," Gideon said, "and we'll keep searching." And they did. In April of 1847, the entire house held its breath. Evangeline's labor was quick and fierce, leaving Gideon so pale that even the midwife laughed gently as she gave instructions, soothing him as if he were a panicked soldier rather than a duke. When the newborn's strong cry filled the room, Evangeline nearly broke, this time with joy. "It's a boy," the midwife announced, placing the warm, rosy bundle in her arms. His eyes, still dark, blinked with some new instinctive curiosity. His little fists curled tight with surprising determination. "Nathaniel," she breathed, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. "His name is Nathaniel." Gideon kissed her forehead and then his son's. "Welcome, my boy." Grace was introduced to her brother the next day. She approached the bed with careful steps, as if afraid of breaking something so precious. "May I call him Nate?" she asked. Evangeline smiled. "Of course you may." Grace nodded, very solemn. "I'll take care of him forever." And in the faithful, uncomplicated way only children understand, she kept that promise. The years that followed flew by, full and bright. Grace grew curious and talkative, full of impossible questions. Nathaniel became a laughing, quick-witted boy who followed his sister as if she were his own small lighthouse. And behind everything, always, there was the search. Gideon read every report, answered every letter, chased every lead, no matter how thin. Evangeline didn't thank him every time, not aloud, but he knew. He knew by the way she gripped his hand on quiet nights, by the way she would come sit beside him when hope seemed to die yet again. It was on an October afternoon in 1849 that everything shifted. Evangeline was in the library with Nathaniel curled against her side, half listening to the story, half playing with the buttons on her waistcoat. Grace appeared in the doorway a little later, proud of having finished her writing lesson. That was when the door opened. Gideon walked in, pulling off his gloves slowly, as if each movement needed to be measured. There was something in his face that Evangeline had not seen in a long time. Hope, real, alive, almost painful. She knew, before he spoke a word, that there was news. "There's been progress," he said, his voice tight with restraint. Nathaniel protested when he felt his mother's body go rigid, but Grace, intuitive as ever, took her brother by the hand. "We'll finish upstairs," she whispered, closing the door behind them. Silence settled. And Evangeline could hear her own breathing, too fast, too shallow. "What kind of progress?" she asked, her voice close to breaking. Gideon came to her. He knelt in front of her, the gesture he saved for the moments that mattered too much to be addressed standing, and took her hands in his. "One of the investigators found records," he began, "of an adoption made 6 years ago, a family named Thompson in Kent. They took in a baby through an intermediary. Quiet payment. No mother's name recorded." Evangeline's heart began to pound so hard it hurt. "Go on," she whispered. "The investigator saw the boy," Gideon said, holding her gaze. "He's about 6, dark hair, brown eyes, healthy, happy, and—" His voice faltered, just for a moment. "He looks very much like you." Evangeline raised both hands to her mouth. The sound that escaped was half sob, half prayer. "We don't know for certain," Gideon went on, honest even here. "But, Evangeline, everything points to him. The age, the timing, the circumstances, the place, the way he was given up." She wept. Years of pain, of buried hope, of terror at believing again. "What do we do now?" she managed. Gideon's fingers tightened around hers. "We go there," he said. "We'll see the boy. We'll speak with the Thompsons, and if it's him, we'll find a way to be part of his life, without tearing him away from the home he already knows." Evangeline closed her eyes, trying to hold the storm inside her chest. 6 years. 6 years since she lost him. 6 years of absence. 6 years of searching. And now, at last, there was a name, a family, a village, a living boy somewhere in the world. Perhaps he was her son. Perhaps he wasn't. But for the first time, there was a road to follow. And as she felt Gideon's hand closing around hers, steady as the roots of the old oak beneath which she had cried so many times, Evangeline allowed herself to do something she had always feared: believe. The search was nearing its end, and imperfect as it might be, she might be about to find not only the past she had lost, but the future that had been stolen from her. Epilogue: The Light at Home, Stonebridge Park, Spring, 1849. Morning sunlight poured generously through the tall drawing-room windows, laying a golden wash over the carpet, the furniture, and the toys scattered across the floor. From the armchair by the cold fireplace, Evangeline watched while Grace and Nathaniel played. Grace built elaborate towers from wooden blocks. Nathaniel, 2 years old, knocked them down with gleeful shrieks. 6 years. Sometimes it seemed impossible that only 6 years had passed since the night she'd arrived at the gates of Stonebridge, soaked through barefoot, with her world collapsing underneath her. If someone had told her then that one day she would be here, wearing a simple lilac gown, feet warm against the rug, hand resting over a gently rounded belly, she would have thought it cruel. But here she was, Duchess of Stonebridge, mother of 2, expecting a third, wife to a man who loved her in a way that still took her by surprise. Her hand moved lightly over her abdomen. 4 months. The midwife, steady and certain, insisted that this time it would be a girl. Evangeline refused to be entirely convinced, but she liked the idea. Gideon had suggested the name Caroline, not as a replacement, but as a quiet tribute to his first wife, the woman who had brought Grace into the world. The thought had made her tense at first, but now it was beginning to feel right, not erasing but adding. Even so, in that moment, She wasn't thinking of the child yet to be born. Nor of Nathaniel, now charging at his sister's architectural masterpiece with destructive enthusiasm, nor of Grace's deeply furrowed brow as she scolded him for causing such a catastrophic earthquake. She was thinking of Michael, or Thomas, as the world knew him. The journey to Kent had taken place a few months earlier. It had been all at once the hardest and the most necessary step she had ever taken. Seeing the boy for the first time, almost 6 now, dark hair with unruly waves, brown eyes achingly familiar, the same little frown she sometimes saw in her own reflection, had been like being pierced by ice and warmed by a sun she thought she'd lost, both at once. My son. The Thompsons were simple folk but good ones. Their cottage was modest and clean, smelling of soup, soap and wood. Mrs. Thompson twisted her apron with shaking hands, eyes wide with fear. The fear of someone who loves and dreads losing what they love. Mr. Thompson held himself straight, but his voice betrayed his anxiety. Evangeline did not blame them. She could not. She had seen the love in the way the woman instinctively gathered the boy close when he was startled, in the quiet pride with which the husband showed her the wooden horse he had carved for his son. She'd watched Thomas run into his adoptive mother's arms without hesitation, hide his face against her neck when strangers entered the room. She knew then, with a certainty that both broke and mended her, that she could not simply take him away. The conversation that followed had been long, painful and honest. Evangeline told them everything. David, the secret courtship, the hidden pregnancy, the birth, the empty cradle, the asylum waiting, the escape. The Thompsons listened in silence, caught between horror and guilt. But when she said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, "I haven't come to take Thomas from you. I don't want to tear him from the only home he's ever known. I only want to see him, to be near if you'll allow it. And one day when he's old enough, I want him to know the truth, that I never abandoned him, that I have loved him since the first day." The terror on their faces began to soften into something else, relief perhaps. After exchanged glances and murmured words between husband and wife, they agreed. Since then, Evangeline had visited 3 times. On the first visit, he called her Lady Carver, with careful politeness, half hidden behind his mother's skirts when she tried to come closer. On the second, he'd ventured out to show her, proud and shy, the wooden horse and the small fenced patch where he played. On the third, he'd sat so close to her on the bench by the hearth that their shoulders touched, staying very still and very intent while she read aloud from a picture book about horses. He didn't call her mother, and she didn't ask him to, but he smiled when he saw her come, and little by little he had begun to look forward to her visits. It was little, measured against the dream of holding him every day, but it was infinitely more than the nothing she'd had before. From upstairs came the sound of footsteps. Gideon was descending the staircase, his mind no doubt still sorting through the latest reports from his study. He paused at the doorway of the drawing-room, not entering at once, just watching. He saw Nathaniel astride a precarious block fortress that clearly had only seconds to live. He saw Grace explaining very seriously the importance of proper foundations. He saw Evangeline leaning slightly forward, distracted, one hand resting over her belly, her gaze far away. 6 years. Sometimes even he was astonished by the turn his life had taken. Before Caroline, with Caroline, after Caroline, and now, with Evangeline. From a distance, it almost felt like watching another man's story. But all it took was one step into the room to know it was, undeniably, his own. He stepped in. "Her penny for your thoughts," he said, crossing to her. Evangeline lifted her eyes and smiled, that smile that still, even now, had the power to steal his breath. "I was thinking of Kent," she replied, "of Thomas, of how life has turned out so different from what I expected, and yet better than I ever dared to hope." He sat beside her. Nathaniel decided at once that his father's knee made an excellent perch and climbed into his lap. "He recognized you on the last visit, didn't he?" Gideon asked. A soft light rose in her eyes. "He did," she said. "When I walked in, he said, 'Lady Carver is here,' and ran to fetch the horse book I left him last time." A quiet laugh escaped her. I think for him, that's what I am. The lady who brings stories and horses. There are worse things to be, Gideon observed. Evangeline nodded, but the tear that slipped down her cheek betrayed the weight beneath the smile. Perhaps he'll never call me mother, she murmured. Perhaps for him that word will always belong to just one person, and that loyalty is right. I have to learn to be grateful for what I have, not torment myself with what I'll never have. Gideon gave her hand a gentle squeeze. And what do you have? He asked, kind but unflinching. She looked at him, then at the children, then at her own belly. I have all of you, she said. I have Grace, who calls me Mama, without anyone teaching her to. I have Nathaniel, who will never know what it is to be born in secret. I have a child here, her hand rested over her abdomen, who will never have to be afraid. I have a boy in Kent who is alive, who is loved, and who from time to time leans his shoulder against mine and lets me read to him. Her voice shook. That is so much more than I ever thought I'd be allowed. And when he knows the whole truth? Gideon asked. About you. About Warwick. About the name he inherited and never used. Evangeline fell quiet for a few moments, letting the question settle. Then he will choose, she said at last. If he wants to know me as his mother, I'll be here. If he prefers to keep things as they are, I'll go on visiting just the same without demanding any title at all. She touched Gideon's face with quiet affection. Love isn't a debt you collect. It's a house whose doors stay open in case someone ever wants to come in. Gideon smiled, a mix of admiration and tenderness. You're getting very wise, Your Grace. It isn't wisdom, she shrugged lightly. It's just survival. I've learned I can't change what I've lost, but I can decide what to do with what's left. He drew her closer and kissed her forehead. And with what was left, he said, you built an entire home. Grace chose that exact moment to declare the destruction of all wooden towers with a triumphant cry of, "Earthquake!" Nathaniel burst into laughter. Gideon pretended to be so shocked he nearly toppled over backward, which sent both children into another storm of shrieks and giggles. The seriousness of a moment before dissolved into noise, life, joy. Evangeline watched it all with a full heart. She thought of the girl she had once been, locked in a room, told she was mad, that nothing she felt was real. She thought of the young mother forbidden to be one. She thought of the woman who had run through the mud until the gates of Stonebridge appeared in the distance like a promise. If she could go back and say something to that version of herself, perhaps it would be, "Wait, it isn't over. This is not the end of your story." Because here in this sunlit room, she finally understood that happiness did not mean getting back everything that had been torn from her. It meant being able to love, in spite of the scars. It meant laughing without fear of punishment. It meant having somewhere to return to. Warwick Hall had been a house but never a home. Kent was home for Thomas, and she had learned to honor that. Stonebridge. Stonebridge was what it had always meant to be. Shelter, root, choice. Gideon sank back onto the sofa, slightly out of breath, a child hanging from each arm. Evangeline leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder. "I love you," she said simply. He turned and kissed her hair. "I love you too," he answered, without a trace of hesitation. "And I don't intend to waste a single day I have at your side." And there, with children's laughter echoing through the room, toys strewn across the floor, the distant smell of baking bread drifting up from the kitchens, and the sweet weight of new life growing inside her, Evangeline Carver allowed herself to believe, without a single reservation, she was home. And this time, no one would ever have the power to take that from her.